Good day everyone, this is Dariene May Muñez and I will be continuing to discuss to you the remaining topics of chapter 15, which is all about Skinner behavioral analysis. In this presentation, we'll be learning the related research. Under this topic is how conditioning affects personality, how personality affects conditioning and reinforcement, and the brain. We will be also learning the critique of Skinner, concept of humanity, and the key terms and concepts of Skinner's study. But before we start, I would just like to apologize for the unnecessary noises you'll be hearing in this video presentation. Anyways, there is no need to worry because I'll make sure that you will hear my voice clearly. And so, without any further ado, let's get into this video. Skinner's ideas have been used in a multitude of studies dealing with complex human behaviors. Some of these studies have been concerned with the relationship between long-term behavior patterns and contingencies of reinforcement. These studies are generally of two kinds. They have asked either how conditioning affects personality or how personality affects conditioning. How conditioning affects personality. It is said that the key elements of personality are stability of behavior over time and across different situations. By this criteria, personality change occurs when new behaviors become stable over time and or different situations. Psychotherapy is one domain in which change of personality may be evident. In fact, ang major goal sa therapy is to change behavior. So if ang changes are stable over time and situations, then that's when one could talk about changing personality. This is to make clear that whereas Skinner discussed changing long-term behavior, he never really discussed changing personality. One basic assumption of Skinnerian conditioning is that reinforcement shapes behavior. Yet, what are the factors that change reinforcement? That is, can certain stimuli become more or less reinforcing for an individual over time? Importante na siya na question in treating people with drug problems because for the treatment to be successful, it will require that a reinforcer or the drug lose its reinforcing value. Example, sa mga smokers, nicotine gradually becomes a negative reinforcer as mild states of tension are removed by the effects of this drug. May mga ebidensya na nagpakita na ang psychomotor stimulants such as cocaine or the amphetamines, which are a kind of drug, na ginapa-increase nila ang smoking level sa katong mga nagasmoke. There are two possible explanations for these effects. First is perhaps the stimulant specifically increases the reinforcing effect of nicotine, and the second one is perhaps psychomotor stimulants simply increase activity in general, and smoking is just one of them. To test these two competing explanations, Jennifer Tiede, Suzanne O'Neill, and Stephen Higgins conducted a study with 13 smokers and put them through an elaborate test procedure with 12 separate 5-hour sessions in which they received either a placebo or the amphetamine. The results showed that smoking levels in both the experimental choice compared to money and in the free smoking sessions increased in proportion to the amphetamine. The higher the dose of the amphetamine, the more the participants smoked. Even more importantly, however, smoking was chosen over money in the choice session in direct proportion to amount of the amphetamine administered. Therefore, the stimulant must increase the reinforcing value of nicotine specifically and not the other reinforcer, which is money. In short, the answer to the question of whether reinforcers can change their value over time and in combination with other stimuli is yes, and in this case, nicotine can become even more reinforcing in the presence of psychomotor stimulants. How personality affects conditioning. Several thousand studies with both animals and humans have demonstrated the power that conditioning has to change behavior or personality. With humans in particular, however, it is clear that different people respond differently to the same reinforcers, and personality may provide an important clue about why this may be so. Going back to research on the amphetamine and smoking, for example, there appears to be systematic individual differences on the effect. That is, it works for some people but not others. Just as in the previous study, Stacy Sigmund and colleagues on 2003 studied the effects that the amphetamine has on smoking using two different reinforcers, which is cigarettes and money. In addition to trying to replicate the finding that psychomotor stimulants specifically increase the reinforcing value of nicotine compared to money, they wanted to examine whether there were any individual differences in the effect. The general result of their study was there was a small effect of the amphetamine on increasing smoking. However, there were significant individual differences. Responders were willing to work harder to get cigarettes under increasing amounts of the amphetamine, but this pattern of result did not hold for the 8 non-responders. The amphetamine had no real effect on their cigarette smoking. Ang mga possible reasons for this effect ay nakita sa subjective ratings of the effect of the drug. According to the responders, they felt drowsy and high and that the drug had good effects. However, on the physiological effects, there was no difference between the two groups, which is the responders and non-responders. Although kanina study kay walay direct evidence, other research provides one plausible explanation for the individual differences seen in the amphetamine. According to them, responders are more likely to be affected by the stimulant kay ang ilang sensitivity sa dopamine is greater to the extent na ang personality kay naay biological basis. It can affect sensitivity to conditioning. Further evidence that temperamental and biological states affects response sensitivity conditioning comes from the theory of Gray and Alan Pickering and their reinforcement sensitivity theory or the RST. These two researchers have conducted dozens of studies testing their theory, and although complex ang kasagaran na result, they generally support the RST. The association between reinforcement sensitivities and other personality dimensions and their interaction have only begun recently to be explored. One of the first studies to examine the differences in anxiety and impulsivity and their association to response sensitivities is the research conducted by Philip Corr. Reinforcement sensitivity theory predicts that introverts or the highly anxious individual should be more sensitive to punishment due to their strong need to avoid aversive states, while the extroverts or the highly impulsive individuals should be more sensitive to reward because of their strong need to experience positive states. In the overall formulation of the theory, the personality dimensions should operate completely independently. Pero ang formulation ni Corr is that they can operate somewhat jointly and independently. Corr predicted that impulsivity should interact with anxiety such that anxious but impulsive people should respond less to a startle stimulus when viewing negative images than anxious but non-impulsive people. Results supported the joint subsystem hypothesis and contradicted the separable subsystem hypothesis. That is, participants who were highly anxious but also impulsive showed a lower startle response, especially when viewing negative images, compared to participants who were highly anxious but not impulsive. The overall point is that people do not respond to reinforcers in the same way, and personality is one of the key mechanisms that moderates their effect. Recently, researchers have taken reaction sensitivity research a step Further, by analyzing individual differences in brain activation as a result of being presented with rewarding stimuli such as food. The researchers in this study used the functional magnetic resonance imaging or the fMRI. fMRI is based on the same technology the doctor may use if he or she orders an MRI of your body to diagnose a health problem. This fMRI detects the flow of oxygen within the brain. Oxygen carried by blood is required for all the brain's activity, and the more oxygen there is in one particular area, the more nanay activity dito on a part. John Beaver and colleagues on 2006 used fMRI to examine what parts of the brain were activated when participants looked at various food-related stimuli and if there were individual differences in personality that predicted this brain activation. Food stimuli were ideal for this experiment because some foods are very rewarding, such as ice cream, cake, and etc., whereas others are not so rewarding, such as bland rice, potato, and etc. The researchers first had their participants to complete the Behavioral Activation Scale or the BAS before conducting their study. BAS is a self-report measure that captures a person's general tendency to actively pursue rewards. Someone who has a high tendency to actively pursue rewards would respond very positively to this item. The researchers were able to determine which area of the brain was activated during the presentation of pleasurable versus bland pictures, and more importantly, if individual differences in self-reported behavioral activation were related to this activation. The researchers found that people who scored higher on the personality variable of behavioral activation experienced increased activation to the pictures of cake and ice cream in 5 specific areas of the brain than their lower behavioral activation counterparts. In other words, the results supported the more general conclusion that personality is related to differences in biological processes of how we respond to reward. Critique of Skinner. Hans J. Eysenck on 1988 once criticized Skinner for ignoring such concepts as individual differences, intelligence, genetic factors, and the whole realm of personality. But these claims are only partly true because Skinner did recognize genetic factors and he did offer an enthusiastic definition of personality, saying that it is at best a repertoire of behavior imparted by an organized set of contingencies. How does Skinner's theory meet the 6 criteria of a useful theory? First, the theory was rated very high on its ability to generate research because the theory has spawned a great quantity of research. Second, most of Skinner's ideas can be either falsified or verified, so the theory was rated high on falsifiability. Third, on its ability to organize all that is known about human personality, the theory only got a moderate rating. Fourth, as a guide to action, the theory of Skinner was rated very high. The abundance of descriptive research turned out by Skinner and his followers has made operant conditioning an extremely practical procedure. The fifth criterion of a useful theory is internal consistency. And judged by this standard, the theory of Skinner was rated very high. Skinner defined his terms precisely and operationally, a process greatly aided by the avoidance of fictionalized mentalistic concepts. The last criteria is the theory parsimonious. Skinner's theory is difficult to rate. On one hand, the theory is free from cumbersome hypothetical constructs, but on the other, it demands a novel expression of everyday phrases. Concept of humanity. B.F. Skinner held a deterministic view of human nature, and concepts like free will and individual choice had no place in his behavioral analysis. People are not free but are controlled by environmental forces. They may seem to be motivated by inner causes, but in reality, those causes can be traced to sources outside the individual. Self-control depends ultimately on environmental variables and not on some inner strength. When people control their lives, they do so by manipulating their environment, which in turn shapes their behavior. This environmental approach negates hypothetical constructs such as willpower or responsibility. Human behavior is extremely complex, but people behave under many of the same laws as do machines and animals. What accounts for this illusion of freedom? Skinner on 1971 held that freedom and dignity are reinforcing concepts because people find satisfaction in the belief that they are free to choose and also in their faith in the basic dignity of human beings. Kay kanina concepts are reinforcing in modern societies, pero once na mawala na ang mga reinforcement value aning freedom and dignity, people will stop behaving as if they existed. Is Skinner's concept of humanity optimistic or pessimistic? At first thought, it may appear that a deterministic stance is necessarily pessimistic. However, Skinner's view of human nature is highly optimistic because human behavior is shaped by the principles of reinforcement. The species is quite adaptable. Of all behaviors, the most satisfying ones tend to increase in frequency of occurrence. People therefore learn to live quite harmoniously with their environment. Is humanity basically good or evil? The answer is neither good or evil. If a person typically behaves for the good of others, it is because this behavior, either in the species' evolutionary history or in the individual's personal history, has been previously reinforced. If one behaves cowardly, it is because the reward for cowardice outweighed the aversive variables. Skinner's theory of personality is very high on causality. It is also very high on the unconscious dimension of personality. Obviously, Skinner's concept of humanity inclines more toward social than toward biological determinants of behavior. Humans are not good by nature, but they can become so if they are exposed to the proper contingencies of reinforcement. Key terms and concepts. Skinner's theory of personality is based largely on his behavioral analysis of rats and pigeons. Although internal states such as thinking and feeling exist, they cannot be used as explanations of behavior. Only overt behavior can be studied by the scientists. Human behavior is shaped by three forces: 1. The individual's personal history of reinforcement, 2. Natural selection, and 3. The evolution of cultural practices. Operant conditioning is a process of changing behavior in which reinforcement or punishment is contingent on the occurrence of a particular behavior. A positive reinforcer is any event that, when added to a situation, increases the probability that a given behavior will occur. A negative reinforcer is any aversive stimulus that, when removed from the environment, increases the probability of a given behavior. Skinner also identified two types of punishment. The first is the presentation of an aversive stimulus, and the second involves the removal of a positive stimulus. Reinforcement can be either continuous or intermittent, but intermittent schedules are more efficient. The four principal intermittent schedules of reinforcement are the fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and the variable interval. Social control is achieved through operant conditioning, describing the contingencies of reinforcement, depriving a person, or physically restraining an individual. People can also control their own behavior through self-control, but all control ultimately rests with the environment and not free will. Unhealthy behaviors are learned in the same ways as all other behaviors, that is, mostly through operant conditioning. To change unhealthy behaviors, behavior therapists use a variety of behavior modification techniques, all of which are based on the principles of operant conditioning. Now we are officially done with the Chapter 15 Skinner Behavioral Analysis. Thank you for listening.